The teaser for Elder Scrolls 6 revealed what seemed to be coastland with rugged hills and mountains beyond, a harbor city nestled in a small valley, and castle ruins atop a lonely crag. The mountains, the coastland, and the rocky terrain are fairly descriptive of two provinces in Tamriel, High Rock and Hammerfell. At least those two seem to be so far the strongest contenders. We did a video on what to expect and what you might not know about High Rock if indeed the new game were to be set there, but today let's look at the other alternative. Hammerfell is located on the far western middle of Tamriel, a land of dunes, deadly monsters, warriors in turbans riding fast horses, blazing heat, and treacherous mountains. This is the land of the Red Guards, fearsome warriors who sailed from the long-lost continent of Yakuta, displacing and destroying anything that got in their way, including all the monsters and orcs that used to reside in the area. Unstopped, they conquered the land and made it their own. Let's talk about 5 things that you probably didn't know about this mysterious jewel of the West. Let's go. Number 1. In virtually every single Elder Scrolls game, we have played in lands that have been previously owned by somebody else. In Morrowind, we got to experience the birthplace of the Dwemer. In fact, some of the oldest constructions that still stand from anywhere in Tamriel are still standing in that place. In Oblivion, we got to explore the Ayleid ruins, the lost cities of the Heartland elves that used to enslave humans before those humans rebelled and butchered them all. In Skyrim, we got to experience a more modern wave of Dwemer, those that migrated from Morrowind and into Skyrim, so the cities were more alive, bigger, and in some ways even intact. We also got to delve into the old cities of the Dragon Priests, the dungeons filled with the interred dead of a bygone time when the Nords submitted themselves to the rules of dragons. And of course, in the DLC, we got to experience the one singular veil of the leftover civilization of the Snow Elves. Now, in Hammerfell, we got dwarves as well, but what you might not know is that there are also countless civilizations that have come and gone in this place. In fact, when it comes to dungeon delving and discovering old tombs and graveyards of old civilizations, there is nowhere else to look but beneath the sands of the place known as the Deathlands. Indeed, the old name for Hammerfell before the moving of the dwarves was Deathlands, the place where civilizations would come and go as the whim of the dunes destroyed them. Every single human civilization from the Dawn times was absorbed and modified. The Nords, even from the beginning, had to adopt dragon lore and dragon costumes. The humans from Cyrodiil were enslaved and forced to contend with the culture of the Heartland elves. The humans from High Rock were enslaved and bred out until no human was left. And the humans from Akaviri were eaten by the vampiric naga of the land. The only place where the humans actually had the peace to create their own culture was in Hammerfell, at least until the very sands devoured them. I'm not talking about the Red Guards, by the way. I'm talking about the old humans that lived in here first. Their leftover cities can still be explored if you simply dig deep enough in the deserts of this place. But that's not all. We of course got a tremendous amount of Dwemer cities, Ayleid ruins, and temples to the gods from the Dawn time. On top of that though, we got something that we have never seen before in any of the previous games. We have the ability to explore and entomb old orcish and goblin ruins. See, Hammerfell used to be the province of the orcs, way before the Red Guards even made their way into this land, as they were the only sentient smart creature that could withstand the outrageous and dangerous Alikir desert, outside of dragons, of course. The reason that orcs and goblins now live in the Dragentail Mountains and in the Hrothgarian Mountains was because the Red Guards completely destroyed them and moved them away from the mainland of Hammerfell after arriving, which means that the land must be dotted with hundreds of old orcish sites just waiting to be dug out and found. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the archaeologist and dungeon delver's wet dream. I don't even have time to mention the enormous amount of monsters that are found in this place, as for the most part, Hammerfell was known to be the capital of beast folk. You should expect mummies, lamias, enormous bugs that surf the sand waves, sand dragons. Honestly, there's just too much. It's also worth mentioning that the capital of the orcs, Orsinium, is currently set in Hammerfell, not in High Rock. If the game is set here, we would be able to explore that burgeoning new city as well. Number 2. Most players are aware of the Rurken clan. This was the group of dwarves that made the first real successful foray into Hammerfell in order to create a long-lasting and flourishing society. This is the clan of dwarves that created Volendrong and Spellbreaker. The legend says that they magically threw Volendrong into the air, exclaiming that wherever it would land, they would move and create their new city. The hammer fell in Hammerfell, hence the name, though the Dwemer version of the name would be Volenfell, which was actually the name that the dwarves gave the province. Most people know this, but what you might not know is that the Rurken clan were not the only set of dwarves that ended up moving here. Inspired by the immigration, the dwarves of Kragen also followed suit. In fact, it was them who built the very first city in Skyrim, what we know as a city of Arkenthams. Thanks to the success of this city, the rest of the Dwemer followed suit. Not every Dwemer made it to Hammerfell though, only the Rurken clan and the dwarves of Kragen ever made it that far, though one could argue that those were indeed some of the more inventive dwarves. We know this because of a particular incredible invention made in Hammerfell, the creation of flying ships. Now the airships were a concept probably created by Kagrenak, one of the greatest minds of Dwemer society. When you play Morrowind, you can indeed find a unique schematic of one such ship. You can also find it beside the book Divine Metaphysics, which is inherently a book about Numidium and about how to create a god or how to become a god. It is interesting that even though the schematic was designed, no such airship was ever made by the Dwemer of Morrowind. And as we can attest from Skyrim, no such device was also ever made by the Dwemer of the North. Kagrenak was allegedly killed in the events that made all the Dwemer disappear. Airships, however, can be found in Hammerfell, which leads us to believe that the Rurken clan must indeed have some of the best and most inventive dwarves of all, as they managed to create such amazing inventions without ever using the Ethereum from Blackreach. It is also possible that the dwarves of Kragen must have taken similar schematics with them on their exodus, and used the power of the Ethereum Forge in Skyrim to build themselves some airships in Hammerfell. Unfortunately though, the city in Hammerfell was taken by a great and powerful dragon, a heretic from the dragon cult named Thurbokun. This dragon was special because it is the only dragon in existence without an immortal soul. That meaning this dragon actually aged like a normal mortal being. Whatever made this dragon that way was a complete secret, and after taking over the Dwemer city, he slowly died of old age. Number 3. You should already know that the Red Guards came from a continent to the far west named Yokura. This continent was owned by the Sinistral Elves. This continent, however, sank deep into the ocean, and before it did, the humans from the continent, the Yokurans, sailed east in order to survive and landed in Hammerfell. They landed about 200 to 300 years after the disappearance of the Dwemer, back in the First Era. They of course went on to defeat all of the monsters and orcs that were currently living in the province. You might not know that the name Redguard actually comes from the first wave of soldiers that sailed from Yokura. This wave was called the Ra-Gada, which of course ended up turning into Redguard. Ra-Gada translates from their language into warrior wave. The name was such because the king of the Yokurans sent in his best soldiers first into a massive armada to take over the province, before all of the nobles and kings would make their way. They wanted to be sure that it was safe before the rest of the Yokurans sailed. You might have already experienced some of the weapons and combat arts that the Ra-Gada used in their conquest, with the blade that you can acquire in Skyrim called Windshear. Fast, curved weapons designed to not allow their enemy to defend itself from attacks. In fact, writings say that the best of the Ra-Gada would kill their enemies before they even knew they were being attacked. You also might not know that it was this great success in their first foray in Hammerfell that ended up turning this ferocious and united group into two permanent warring factions. Similar to how the politics look in Skyrim with the Empire and the Stormcloaks, you have two groups of individuals in Hammerfell. The Forebears are the group of Redguards that come from the Ra-Gada, the first wave of warriors that took over the land. This group first settled in Hammerfell and became friendly and traded with the Imperials from Cyrodiil. Something they needed to do because of how harsh the environment in Hammerfell was. Having friends proved to be useful to them and it allowed to settle easier. This group of Redguards are very Empire friendly and share many costumes and cultural accoutrements from the Empire. The other group are what is called the Crowns. These were the kings and noblemen alongside the rest of the non-fighting middle class that came late from Yokura and into Hammerfell. The Crowns came late into Hammerfell and wanted to enact their laws and old cultural practices into this new newfound territory. This, however, didn't land very well with the already established towns. They already had their own ruling and their own system, which created a lot of problems. In essence, the forebears trade heavily with the Empire and share many customs and culture with them. The Crown want to keep the old traditions alive and are more conservative. These two political groups vie for control in the province. Number 4. There are only 3 major outside factions that threaten the complete destruction of Tamriel, if not the whole world. You could even consider these forces to be the actual last bosses of Elder Scrolls. First are the Daedra. Tamriel already suffered an enormous invasion from Mehrunes Dagon in the events of Elder Scrolls Oblivion, and the main story of Elder Scrolls Online deals with the invasion of Molag Bal. If Tamriel were to be destroyed, chances are a Daedra is behind it. Second are the Akaviri, specifically the Taeski, an extremely powerful race of vampiric snake people bent on eating anyone they find. It has been foretold that the last thing that this world will suffer will be what is called the Last War. In this war, everyone will fight for Tamriel, and possibly only one will succeed. The main competitor in this war will be the Taeski, who want nothing more than to take over and invade this continent. Thirdly, we have the Slodes, an amphibious, slug-like, magical race of monsters that live in the Isles of Thrash and below the water. It is impossible to tell how far their kingdom spreads, as it has never been charted or explored, and they could very well now own the entirety of the sunken continent of Yokura. You probably didn't know that the literal most horrible event in Tamrielic history, even worse than any of those 2 Daedric invasions, was what is known as the Thrashian Plague, a Slode-engineered plague magically created and sent into the continent. It was responsible for the deaths of more than half of Tamriel's population, including non-sentient creatures like monsters and livestock. When the biggest fleet ever amassed went on to fight the Slodes simply sunk their own islands, protecting themselves from much of the retribution. Now, of course, these guys are the ones I want to talk about. They are known to primarily hate and fight the High Elves, but there has been tons of skirmishes with the Red Guards, and pretty recent too. If there was any speculation about what could be the main story of Elder Scrolls 6 Hammerfell, then right at the top you would have to guess that Slodes being the main enemy. They are some of the strongest necromancers in the world, to the point where their entire culture, religion, and society is based on reanimating the dead. They also possess very powerful teleporting magic, since their bodies are incredibly slow while on the ground. They are believed to possess airships similarly to the old Dwemer, though whether they stole this technology or developed it themselves is not known. We also do not know what kind of leadership they might have and what kind of evolutionary processes their bodies might go through, as rumors have come forth of Lovecraftian creatures at the depths of the Thrashian cities. To further drive home this point, a small town in Elder Scrolls Oblivion called Hackderd claims to have made contact with a powerful new race of creatures that they dubbed the Deep Ones. The name Deep Ones is a reference to H.P. Lovecraft novels and the types of monsters that you would find in those novels. In the town, you can find a book called The Bible of the Deep Ones, in which the writings inside are eerily similar to that of Engasta Kavata Kavakis. This book is made by a Slode, and the language is very similar, suggesting that the Deep Ones are indeed the Slodes, which further adds credence to the possibility of crazy deep monsters in the deep sea that are allied or are part of the Slode race. In short, if Elder Scrolls 6 were to be set in Hammerfell, I think we would see some really crazy stuff. If not in the main quest, then at least through some sweet underwater DLC. Number 5. The Great War between the Aldmeri Dominion and the Tamrielic Empire destroyed much. It ended up in somewhat of a standstill, but only because the Empire surrendered directly after a major victory. The Emperor thought that they couldn't continue the war, but what he didn't know was that the Aldmeri forces were similarly exhausted, and it was a war that could have actually been won. As a concession for their surrender, the Empire agreed to ban the worship of Talos, as well as surrendering some of the southern portion of Hammerfell. We obviously know how much this enraged a large portion of the populace of Skyrim, who loved Talos. This, of course, ended up fomenting the civil war between those who wanted to separate from the Empire and those who wanted to stay. In Hammerfell, Hammerfell, that decision was a lot easier to make. The Empire had betrayed Hammerfell by agreeing to surrender a huge portion of its southern coastline, and because of that, Hammerfell as a whole denied the White Gold Concordat and continued fighting. In order to keep the peace treaty, the Empire had to give up ownership of Hammerfell, which further betrayed the province. Hammerfell was left to fend for itself in a war against the Thalmor by themselves. And shockingly, Hammerfell won. They managed to fight for 5 years until the Aldmeri forces simply could not keep going at it. The prospect of moving reinforcements and supplying the war effort by ship through the Abyssian Sea, as well as the soldiers surviving the harsh environment of Hammerfell, proved too much for the elves. The Second Treaty of Strosmakai was signed and the elves left the shores of the province. This means that Hammerfell is not part of the Empire anymore and are fully independent, which would allow for the worship of Talos on the more Empire-friendly cities, like the cities owned by the Forebears. It has been told to us, however, that the south of Hammerfell was completely destroyed during the war, including Ghislaine, Tanith, Rehad, and Strosmakai. Helgath, or Helgathi, was allegedly never captured by the Aldmeri forces and would have been intact. In Skyrim, we're actually told that it was because of Sadia that the city of Tanith fell in the first place, that she sold out the city to the Aldmeri Dominion, and if it wasn't for her, the city would have actually survived the war and would have held out. When the noble houses figured out her betrayal, she fled to Skyrim in order to hide. What's more interesting, however, is that Kematu claims that the resistance against the Aldmeri Dominion is, and I quote, alive and well in Hammerfell, end quote. It seems to allude to the fact that there is a current war being fought against the Dominion on the southern border of Hammerfell. It is entirely possible that the Second Treaty of Strosmakai was simply a momentary stop to the war, and that now, that war has begun again in earnest. I would like to thank my Patreon supporters Anthony Dial, Wyatt Curlin, Nephilim Drake, Toby Oliver, Dylan Baker, and Casey Butler for supporting me on Patreon at the $25 level. If you'd like to support me as well, then head on over to patreon.com/MrRhexx to help out. If you have any suggestions for videos, be sure to leave a comment below. Thank you so much for watching and have a great week.